When I was having dinner with Wayne last night, I was asking him, like while you're sitting writing your books, what happens when you can't get any information or you have trouble writing? And he told me that one of the things that he does is he does this I am wishes fulfilled meditation. In fact, he said he did it 3 hours yesterday. And so I just wanted to give you like at least one extra little tip that might help you with your writing, so that you might want to do like some kind of meditation or something like that, just to relax and let the words come through when you're having trouble getting those. So I wanted to say that, and I'll let Wayne do the rest of the talking.
I really don't know how to talk about writing, because writing isn't something that I do. Writing is something that I am. And the words I am, if you come to my talk tonight, I'm sure many of you will be there, the words I am are really the name of God. God's words to Moses when he asked, "What is your name?" He said, "My name is I am that I am." So every time you use the words I am, you're using the name of God. And writing and who I am, and it's a spiritual thing for me. But Reed asked me to speak to you about the earlier days of writing. I wrote my first book when I was 16. It was terrible. It was called The Anomalous Compatriot. Most of us don't even know what the word means. And when I was in the service, I was in the Navy for 4 years. I wrote about 600 or 700 essays about everything that I could, everything that I could think about. I was almost court-martialed when I was in the Navy, and threatened because I was on Guam, and they had a policy in the Navy that if you were a civilian there on Guam, you could shop in the Navy exchanges where the prices were seriously reduced. But if you were Guamanian, which meant that you had brown skin, you weren't allowed. This was 1961. And the Guam Daily News invited an invitation to speak your mind, it was called, on the back page of the paper, and they had a contest, and the first prize was $75. So I entered the contest and won it, which I knew I would. And they published my picture in the Guam Daily News back in 1961. And the commander of the naval forces in the Marianas Islands threatened me with a court-martial because I had violated the chain of command. I hadn't gotten permission to say something about the Navy policy without going through the chain. Well, if I had gone through the chain, I wouldn't have been able to publish it, and we wouldn't be able to get the policy changed. So Joseph Heller wrote a whole book about that called Catch-22. So they called me in and they threatened to have me court-martialed. And that's when I just took my writing, and I wrote a letter to President Kennedy. I wrote a letter to the Detroit Free Press. I wrote a letter to the Detroit News, and showed him the letters. I hadn't sent them, and said, this is going to be, because President Kennedy was very big on civil rights and changing things. He was the first president to really, he and his brother, Bobby Kennedy, whose son I was just with up in Rhinebeck last week, were very instrumental in changing a lot of it. I mean, when I was in the Navy, the Navy was segregated. Basically, the black sailors were stewards. And even the ones that were doing the kind of work that I was doing had separate quarters. I walked into a restaurant in Maryland, and I had, with my friend Rayford Secondus Dudley, who was from Chicago, we were both in the uniform of the United States Navy, and in Maryland, Havre de Grace, Maryland, and we were not allowed to eat there because Ray was black. That's not very long ago. I wrote a letter about that to the Chief of Naval Operations, and sort of used my writing as a way of expressing who I am. And having, and we got the policy changed. They saw that I really meant who I was, and I was just a young 21-year-old second-class petty officer in the Navy. But before I left there in June of 1961, they had changed that policy. And they withdrew any charges and gave me an early discharge, which was the nicest thing I could have ever had. And then got out at the age of 22 and went to the university and got my PhD after 7-8 years, and started writing. I was writing articles and essays. I had a whole series of almost 700 essays that I had written on every subject that you could imagine. And I was also a voracious reader, which is the way I think you learn how to write, by reading. Listen to Herman Melville in Moby Dick. For as this appalling ocean surrounds the verdant land, you hear the image? So in the soul of man lies one insular Tahiti, full of peace and joy, but encompassed by all of the horrors of the half-lived life. I memorized that when I was a teenager because writing just doesn't get much better than that with the imagery and so on. And you get to be a great writer by being a great reader, I think. And I wanted to write something. I was writing textbooks. I had written 3 textbooks plus a doctoral dissertation, which is another book. And I came upon this idea of writing a sort of a common sense approach to how to manage your life. And my feelings at that time in my early 30s was that people's lives were out of control because they just didn't use common sense. I often say that my success in writing about psychology wasn't because of my training. It was in spite of it. Because I was trained to be a Jungian analyst for a while, and I was trained to get people to go back into their past and examine the kinds of struggles and traumas that they had gone through and overcome them, and then somehow the present will become better if you resolve these things. And it just didn't make sense to me. It just, I lived in an orphanage. I knew how to get along in life. I knew how to rely upon myself. Self-reliance was the theme of your Erroneous Zones. And I would write about that. And I was teaching, I was a professor at a university in New York, St. John's University. And my lectures were all based on what I was going to write. And I wanted to write a book that would reach people. And so and a big theme of my life, and I've just done a new public television special that will be airing in March, and it's based on the new book that will be coming out, which will be a mind blower. This new book, Wishes Fulfilled. It's going to revolutionize the way people think about who they are, and also about their relationship to God. As you'll hear tonight, if you're there tonight. Are you coming tonight? Most of you coming tonight? Okay. So you'll hear me talk about that tonight. But it's so here's the theme. If you want to accomplish something, anything, you must first expect it of yourself. And I mean, if you're writing anything down or if you're tattooing anything to the inner forehead of yours that you can remind yourself of. Ask yourself, what do you expect of yourself? You know, and do you expect to be ordinary, or do you expect to be extraordinary? Because you've been raised to be ordinary, which isn't bad. Because to get to extraordinary, I think of myself as an extraordinary person, and I have extraordinary accomplishments, but my life is very ordinary in many ways. I mean, I have to fill out the forms just like you do, and I have to stop at red lights, and I have 8 kids, all of who, you know, have all of their issues, and I have to obey the rules and get along, and I will die too. You know, I mean, it's like, and I have grandchildren and children that are, you know, that I've devoted my life to being. There's ordinary, but extraordinary encompasses all of ordinary, and then it's the gap between ordinary and extraordinary where I'm speaking to you right now. It's saying, okay, I have filled out the forms, and I've taken care of business, and I've taken care of my family, and I've filled out all of the things that I'm supposed to do, and I'm a good person, a good citizen, and but it's just not enough. Not if you're coming from and I assume that, you know, you wouldn't sign up for something like this, spend the money. Do you pay for this? Do you actually pay to hear read? That hard to believe. Maybe you're beyond help. I don't know. But and you wouldn't come and spend a whole day, and you wouldn't be here if you didn't have a vision or an expectation for yourself. But even as you have an expectation for yourself as a writer, do you have an extraordinary expectation for yourself as a writer, or do you have an ordinary one? And you can always look at that concept of moving into exalted levels. See, what has always fascinated me is people who live at extraordinary levels of awareness. I'm right now reading the biography of Stephen Jobs. Jobs. I don't know why I call him Jobs, but I mean, it wasn't the book of Jobs. I don't know. And as weird as he is, and you look at his history, and if you think his is weird, if you knew mine, I've wallowed around in the depths of struggle and weirdness. And I've listened to my own inner voices, and a lot of times they take me in a very different direction than they take other people. But extraordinary consciousness is, and I was deeply and profoundly moved by a man named Abraham Maslow when I was a doctoral student and sought him out. And he talked about self-actualizing people as people who live at a different level of awareness, who have a different set of values. And I was so intrigued by his teachings when I read an essay called The Whole Man, a 57-page essay about what these people are like, that he called self-actualizers. And I've written about it myself. I wrote a whole book based on that, about how to raise children on it, called What Do You Really Want for Your Children? I wrote a book called The Sky's the Limit, which was based upon how to apply that sort of self-actualizing theories in our own life. And I've lived by it my whole life. So when I published your Erroneous Zones, and the interesting thing about Erroneous Zones, which is a book that today has, I'm not sure really, but it's in the neighborhood of 60 million copies out there in 47 languages. I mean, it's in like 5 different languages in India alone. I mean, it's in Chinese, and a lot of the countries that it was banned in when it was published, all the communist countries, we had to smuggle the books in. Now it's published in Belarusian and Polish and Bulgarian and so on. And my vision for myself and for this, especially for this book, was all revolved around this idea of writing from a place of where my heart was. I wrote Erroneous Sounds from my heart, and speak to you about it now from my heart. And when I finished publishing it, and I went to the publisher, I had an agent, and one of the things I believe is that when you're on your right path and you have passion for what it is that you do, that the universe conspires with you because you're aligned with source energy. You become part of the creative process. And the creative process is God consciousness. And when you're in God consciousness, the universe will just send you the right people. And I mean, that isn't like something that you can just sort of bank on, except that after a while you do. And you just sort of get a knowing, and you have an awareness that I'm on the right path, and this is what I'm doing, and my heart tells me this is my calling. I wrote a book recently called Inspiration, Your Ultimate Calling. Inspiration, it breaks down to in spirit. Your calling is a spiritual calling. And when you feel that, and you feel called by it, then, you know, there's that old saying that when the student is ready, the teachers will appear. The teachers are everywhere. They might be sitting right next to you. It might be this room. That might be this little talk that I'm giving to you here this morning. You don't know. I mean, but I just read something by Mary Oliver. Anybody in the room know who Mary Oliver is? Let me see. Yeah. She's a very famous poet who lives out on Cape Cod. And they ask her, what's your formula for success? She's 71 years, my age, 71 years old. And she said three things. She said, one, pay attention. Just pay attention. Two, be astonished. You know, live from a place of bewilderment. And three, tell other people, which is what you're here for, to tell other people. Just do that, she said, and pay attention. And notice when the right things come up and when the right people, and get your ego out of it. So let me tell you the story of how Erroneous Sounds was published. And then I'll tell you what I did with it, and then I'll take a few questions. And Reed, you tell me when to stop.
Yeah,
so,
no
yeah.
problem.
I was lecturing at St. John. I was a professor, associate professor at St. John's University in Queens. And all the years that I was a graduate student, which was a lot, 8 years of college after the Navy, I would sit in a classroom and I would always be astonished at how bad the lecturers were, how bad the teachers were, the professors were. Not about how that they didn't know their business. They knew their stuff. I was at the University of Michigan, and I was at Wayne. These were very good schools at Wayne State University, but they were just bad. They would look out, and their audience would be bored, and they would be. And I can remember sitting there in my 20s and thinking, when I am on stage, not if I am on stage, because I knew that I would be on stage. Because I'd already spent 4 years in the Navy, and I was giving lectures on philosophy, epistemology, things like that over there on Guam. I mean, I was a very different kind of sailor than they had encountered. And I can remember vowing that because I just knew I was going to become a school teacher, you know, and I started out just as a high school teacher. I knew that when I taught classes, my classes were going to be entertaining and compelling and interesting and fascinating and exciting, and I wasn't going to read to them from my notes, and I was going to, you know, come there and just entertain and get people to want to hear more. I mean, I feel that way right now. I just feel like, you know, right here in this room. I watch my audience. Are you paying attention? Are you interested? And if you're not, I'll go off into another area. I'll tell a joke or make it funny or tell a story, whatever it might be. But do you remember that when you were in college and high school, how bad these teachers were? Not bad at teaching necessarily, but bad at just communicating, just making it fun. I mean, who were the teachers? Who was your favorite teacher? What was I'm sure every one of you have a favorite teacher, and that was the person that made you laugh, that was interested in you, that could make it come alive, right? And the endless, boring lectures that you went to so I made up my mind that was what I was going to be. So when I took this position as a professor at St. John's University, I made my classes come alive. It didn't matter what sometimes I taught tests and measurement. You know, like, how do you make tests and measurement come alive? First time I went in there, I told everybody that it's all graduate students. I said that everybody in this room, I'm going to give a test next week. It's an IQ test, and your grade will be determined about how well you do on this. And I had them totally convinced that their whole life and whether they were going to go on in graduate school was dependent upon how they did on this test. I scared the shit out of them. I mean, it was like, and I said to them, as I passed out the test, you know, and I said, this is what you do to your students all the time with these tests that you're making them take. And so, do you see the anxiety? Do you see the stress? And I taught tests and measurements from the perspective of intelligence tests measure how well you take intelligence tests. That's all they measure. They don't measure anything else. And they aren't predictive of anything. Anyway, so I would make it come alive. And they would walk out and I'd say, you don't have to worry about that. You're going to pass this course. You just have to. Because my lectures started, and I would use a lot of humor, and sometimes it was salacious, and sometimes it was, you know, I thought of myself sort of a frustrated comedian, so there was a lot of laughter and having a lot of fun. And before you know it, people would say, you got to come to this guy Dyer, come to his class. And I actually had the dean come to me and complain that all of the parking places at the university were being taken up by non-students who were coming to your class, because I would have 40 students in my class and there'd be like 100 people there, or sometimes 200-300 people there, because it was just like an event. I would make 2.5 hours of just fun, and I recorded everything, and it was all my preparation for your Erroneous sounds. I would do a week on guilt. I'd do a whole lecture on guilt, and I would do one on fear of the unknown, and all the things that became your Erroneous sounds. And there was a woman in the class who encouraged me to come out to a place at the Educational Assistance Center in Port Washington, New York, and to give a lecture there on Monday night. I had Monday nights free. And so I had people come out. They signed up for $20 for 4 lectures. $4 or $5 lectures, Monday night for 2 hours. I recorded everything, all right? And in that, one of those classes, so after 4 weeks, the class, I said, how many would like to extend it for 4 weeks? Not only would they extend it, but they would bring more people. The next class, we had 20 in the first class. The second class, we had 80 people, and we were overflowing. And 3 years later, at Schreiber High School in Port Washington, New York, we had 1,200 people every Monday night paying $20 a lecture, and I was going home with paper bags full of money that I didn't even know what to do with. It's true. Big shopping bags filled with $20 bills and so on. So in the audience there one night was a woman named Harriet Pine, and Harriet saw some kind of potential. Her husband was Artie Pine, and he was a literary agent in New York, someone that who has passed on now, but Reed knows, or knew, and his son took it over. And he sent me a letter and asked, and now I had written all these notes on your Erroneous sounds and given all these lectures on Erroneous sounds. And I had Artie called me up and he said, would you be interested in, my wife tells me something, would you be interested in doing a book on what you're writing about? And I was so excited. I thought, this is like, pay attention. When the student is ready, they'll happen, they'll show up. The problem is that they're always there, you just don't notice them, because we don't go through life paying attention. We don't notice the room, we don't notice everything, we just don't pay attention. So, I sent him an outline and a sample chapter, and he made an appointment with a guy named Paul Farges. I don't know if you ever, did you know Paul?
No.
No? He was the head of a company at that time called T.Y. Crowell Publishers. And Funk and Wagnalls was a division of T.Y. Crowell. So I went for this meeting in the city, in Manhattan, met Paul, and as I sat down with Paul at his desk, he looked like he was so sad and so depressed. I was a therapist, and I looked at him, I said, what is going on with you? He's a man in his 30s. And he said, well, you're not here to talk about me. He said, you're here to talk about your book. Tell me about it. I said, no, I don't want to talk about my book. I said, we can do that anytime. I said, what's going on with you? And this is a big part of this whole story because it's like I got my attention off of myself. I was hearing Cheryl talking about whether your picture is going to be on something and, you know, me, what's in it for me? And you really need to get out of that consciousness and shift out of the ego and into the world of spirit, where your motivation for writing is to serve, you know, to reach, to assist, not to make money, not to, I mean, I'm hearing you talk about getting self-published and all of that, but by and large, if your energy isn't on just improving the quality of life for someone, whatever kind of book that you're writing, then it's very likely that you're not going to reach the levels. It's like Thoreau's definition of success was the best ever. If you advance confidently in the direction of your own dreams and endeavor to live the life which you have imagined, you will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. It will chase you. That's a hard one for so many people because we're so determined that we're the ones who are going to do it. At any rate, I sat there and talked to Paul. He said, well, he said, if you really want to know, he said, my wife last night, we have 2 children, ages 6 and 9 or something, and he said, my wife last night told me that she wants to get a divorce, that she's seeing someone else. She's not in love with me anymore. And he started sobbing, tears rolling down his face. And he said, and we sat there for 4 hours. And I did therapy with him, if you want to call it therapy. I talked to him, gave him what my advice was, what I would do, how you could handle this, how you have to understand that sometimes these things that come into our life are the greatest gifts that we've ever been given. It's hard for you to see now. And the truth of it is he's remarried now and so on after many years. But and then I left and we never got around to my book. And Artie called me that night. He said, well, how did it go? And I said, we never talked about my book. And the next day, Artie called and said, you've got a contract. He said, Paul said to me, I don't care what this man writes. I want him with us. That's a true story. And yeah, thanks. I had all these lectures that I had been giving at the university that I had been taping, and I went away and I wrote the whole thing after another experience in finding my father, and it's another story altogether. Push that one over there. And I went and I wrote the whole thing out. I sent the manuscript into them. We went through the process, and the book was published. The title was sent to me by a former student of mine named Susan Foti, Sue Foti. And I had just asked, as I had asked everyone, I'm writing this book. It's about common sense. It's about the mistakes that we make. It's the mistakes in thinking. It's about the errors in the way that we think. And she said, it's about errors in the way you think? I said, yeah. She said, what about erroneous sounds? And so we submitted it, and people thought they were getting a sex book. It's true. I went into a bookstore in Des Moines, Iowa, and there was my face on a book right next to Debbie Does Dallas, and and the pizza man always delivers. It's true. I looked at it, I said, there's my smiling face up there. The guy who looked at it said, well, this must be where this goes. So so now I've got a book. Now, I was selling a lot of books because I still had this thing going over in Port Washington. First night it came out, I think I sold like 1,000 copies. We just had it over there, and People magazine later came and did a story of me, and they saw me, taking in the $20 bills, but it was, at that time, it was $7 for the book, and $6.95 in hardcover is what the book was. But I was selling books at the place and so on. But you see, if you want to accomplish something, you must expect it of yourself. And it wasn't that I wanted to have a bestseller. It wasn't that I wanted to make a lot of money. It never occurred to me. That was just, that's all stuff that came after me. It's all stuff that chased me. I just loved what I did so much. And I loved this book so much. And I felt that it had really a lot to offer, and people were reading it and saying, wow, this really means something. I find out now that about something like 800 universities and community colleges were using your Erroneous songs, and still do, as textbooks in their classes and so on. And people are touched by that book, and it's just, all it is a book about common sense and how not to allow other people's opinions to rule your life, and how to live in the present and not be filled with guilt, and how to love yourself, and how to get rid of jealousy and anger and fear and worry and stuff that people just are so immobilized by. And I just boiled it all down to it's just a mistake in the way you think. So I just had such a different vision for myself, and I was so excited about it that I started doing, there's a guy in New York City, his name was Long John Nebel. Any New Yorkers here? Remember that name? Remember Long John Nebel? Anybody? No? You do back there? People way in the back were so old. He was married to Candy Jones, who also had written a book on. Anyway, he had a radio station and a radio show on WMCA, I think it is, a big, and WOR, and he was on all night long from midnight till, and he had prostate cancer. And he had to sit on one of those like inner tube things because he had had surgery and so on. And he would have me come in, and I would sit there and talk to him, but he had to get up and walk around, and he would leave. Sometimes he'd leave for like a whole hour and just walk around. Literally, he would, and I would just do the show, because very few commercials late at night on that. And the next day, you couldn't find my book anywhere, and I just kept coming back and doing that and doing radio shows, and it got so exciting. And I contacted every radio show. The first radio station I ever did was in West Babylon, New York, WBAL, some little 15-minute radio show. So I would call the publisher and find out, always want to know, how's the book doing? How's the book doing? And they'd say, well, they had what we call a list mentality. 3 months it'll be on this list, and then we'll go on to the next list of books and so on. But I didn't have that expectation for myself. I had an expectation, this was too good to just be out there for 3 months and then to be put on the back shelf and become something that people forget about. So I said, when are you going to print a second printing? And they said, well, we have to sell the first printing first, and you're very unknown, nobody knows who you are. So I called up Albany, and I became a bookstore. Albany is the state capital of New York, and I gave them a little license number and paid $10, I think, and got a license to be a business, a Wayne Dyer bookstore, and I ordered all the rest of the first printing. I did. And I had them shipped to the garage in the house that I was living out in West Babylon at that time. And then, I called them up, and the guy's name was Lou. And I said, so just check on how the first printing is doing. He said, look, you were just called last week. I said, yeah, but maybe and he said, all right, okay. And he called, holy shit. He said, this book is selling. He said, we're going to have to do a second printing. I said, okay. So they did a second printing. First printing, I think, was 2,500 books. Second printing, I think, was like 3,500 books. And I ordered those too. I bought those up as well. All 3,500. And then I ordered the third printing, and I bought those up. So I had about 9,000 or 10,000 books in the garage. I did. And And I was selling them at the high school where I was teaching, and I was doing a few talks around Long Island and so on. And then I decided in 1976, when my daughter Tracy, who you'll see tonight, she was 9 years old. And so I talked to her and I said, we're going across the country. And because I had a publicist that I hired, her name was Donna Gould, and I said to Donna, you know, my publisher tells me, Lou tells me, and Artie tells me that the only way to reach everybody in the country is to get on Phil Donahue. And if you can't get on Phil Donahue's show, then you've got to get on The Tonight Show. And if you can't get on The Tonight Show, you've got to, you know, do the Mike Douglas show. And if you can't get Mike Douglas, you know, there was all these different shows that were on there. And that's the only way you can reach everybody. At that time, those were the only syndicated shows. And I said, well, Donna would call them and call them and call them, send them books. And finally, they just said, look, we don't even want to hear the name Wayne Dyer again. So I just made the decision that there's another way to reach everybody in America. It takes a little longer. It's not quite as easy as going on Oprah, as Cheryl did. So I packed all of these books in my car and began to distribute them myself. And I would go from, I couldn't get in on any markets in the large cities, but if you go to a small city, like instead of going to Cincinnati, you could go to Columbus. And in Columbus, they'll put you on the radio if you've got a new avocado dip. You know, it's like, they got and I literally would go and find out, there was Little Professor, do they still have Little Professor bookstores? No. No? Well, they did at that time, and I would go to the Little Professor bookstore, and I would go in, it's absolutely true, and I would ask them if they would put my book in their stores, and on consignment. And if you sell them, you can pay for them. If you don't, just ship them back, and I'll pay the cost. And then I would have my wife at the time, and she would call. She was really good at different accents, and when I was on the radio, she would call these bookstores using the accent. When I think about what I did now, it's like, I don't know if this is even legal. But she would do it in a Swedish accent, and then she'd do it in a German accent, and then she'd do it in a French. She spoke French. She spoke like 5 languages. And she would call these different bookstores, Erroneous, some kind of zones. This man's talking. What is this book? I must have this book. And then the next day, I would go back to all of these bookstores. There were like 4 or 5 of them, and Columbus was one of the cities I did this in. And I'd say, how are you doing? And they'd say, oh my God, we've had so many calls. Can you leave us some more books? It's a true story. And they would be getting calls as well. And then I would move on to the next city and to the next city. And then we went all the way across the country. We spent like 4 or 5 months going across the country. And then a friend of mine named Howard, who's now a friend of mine, named Howard Papish, was in New York, and he had heard on one of the radio shows that I was doing in New York, because I was on the radio every day. I would book myself on all of these. You know, New York City has so many radio stations, and each little community has a radio station, and I would go on there any opportunity that I had to talk about it, and I never thought about selling books. I mean, it wasn't like I'm going to make money and all that. I just really wanted people. I don't know, I was just basking in the fun and the joy of how exciting all of this was. I met this little short, heavy-set black woman in Baltimore named Oprah Winfrey, who was 22 years old, I think, doing a show called People Are Talking. And she just took a liking to me, and I did her show in Baltimore every time they had a ratings period, February, she would call, and this is my favorite author in the world, and and she would invite me to come over and have dinner with her, and it was like, it was a very interesting time. But I'll just tell you this one story, and then we'll take a few questions. So Howard called me, and he was at a party out on Long Island. What's that Tony place out on Long Island, the real fancy? The Hamptons, yeah. He was at some kind of a party out there at the Hamptons. And somebody there at the party was talking about this book with a weird title called Your Erroneous Zones. And they gave it to him, they handed it to him. And they said to him, read this book. And someone else had handed him another book. And so he had these two books. And he got on a plane to fly, and he was the talent coordinator for The Tonight Show. And so he got on the plane, and he had to decide between reading this one that woman was raving about and another book. It was a book about being hit by lightning, I think, and having your guts ripped out of you. So I think Cheryl Richardson wrote it, I think. I don't know. Anyway, so he picked Erroneous Zones. When you advance confidently in the direction of your own dreams, when you have an expectation for yourself. So he read, all the way out to Los Angeles, he read this book, and he's a gay man who has come out since then, but he was married at the time to a woman, and he was like in deep struggle with this whole thing about, it's interesting because I just saw the most fabulous movie that was made in 2004. I bought it just yesterday. I want to see it again and again. It's called The Lovely. If you haven't seen it, watch it. It's the story of Cole Porter, who was a gay man in a marriage. And it just hit me that it was such a beautiful, beautiful film, and some of the greatest music ever written by this man in his turmoil. But anyway, so Howard read the book, and he was so taken by it that he went to Johnny Carson. Now, I had had no national publicity at all. I had only been doing these local shows in all the different, instead of going to Seattle, I would go to Tacoma. And in Tacoma, somebody would know somebody in Seattle, and my daughter and I and my wife, we spent months and months and months just on the road, distributing books, having them shipped, and so on. Then Howard reads the manuscript, goes to Johnny Carson and said, this guy, he's just really got something here. Would you be interested in having him on the show? With Freddie DeCordova, who was the producer of the show. And they said, well, have him come out and we'll do a pre-interview with him. So they flew me out there on a Wednesday, and I flew out. By this time I was back in Michigan, and they called, Howard called me and said, we'll fly you out there if you'd like to do a pre-interview. So I went in there and I did the pre-interview, and then I flew back. And the next day they called me and they said, Johnny said that he would like to have you, he'll have you on the show. And this is the biggest break there ever was, you know. So I went out there, and instead of being on with Johnny, I was on a Monday night, the following Monday night. I was on with a guy named Shecky Green, who's a Las Vegas comedian. And Shecky and I got on the show, and we just hit it off. I was kibitzing with him, having fun with him, you know. We did a little arm wrestling thing, and we were talking. It was just, he's a very funny, funny man. And at that time, Johnny didn't really host the show. He didn't do the show on Monday or Tuesday. He was only doing it 3 days a week. So Shecky just loved it, and we did 2 segments and promoted the book, and I was so excited. Told everybody I'm going to be on the Tonight Show. This is going to be great. First guest I was on with was the first guest on the show that night was Steve Allen, someone I had been watching since I was a little boy, and had always said that when I talked to Steve Allen, I mean, this is all stuff I knew when I was a kid, truly. But that's another story. So, so we do the show, and it's Monday night, and I fly all the way back to Michigan to pick up my car and stay on with the journey. And I get a call from when I was at the airport. They said, this is the first time in the history of The Tonight Show that the show has been preempted. It was the Republican National Convention in Kansas City, Missouri, and what's the guy's name? The Republican guy who was wounded in the war, had the withered arm. Bob Dole. So Bob Dole gave the keynote address that night on the Republican National Convention on Monday night, and he went over, and they stayed with it, and NBC stayed with it, so they preempted the show. So everybody that I had told that I was on The Tonight Show, it turns out I wasn't on The Tonight Show. It had never happened before. So I get back to Michigan and I'm all upset and, wondering, wow, what kind of bad luck is this? And I get a call from Howard on Tuesday, after I'm all the way back there, and he said, we were at the meeting this morning at the Tonight Show, and they were talking about you last night and how great it was, even though it didn't air. And Johnny said, if he's that good, I'd like to have him on before that show re-airs, whenever it re-airs. So Howard said, do you think you could fly back out to Los Angeles? This was the next day. And I said, no, I'm very, very busy. My screen doors have to be cleaned, and so I was on a plane, and I flew back to Los Angeles on Tuesday, and I was on the Tonight Show that night with Johnny Carson on Wednesday night. Well, Johnny ran over that night, as he often did. This is when the Tonight Show was 90 minutes long. And there was an author spot at that time. So Johnny ran over, and we only had about 4 or 5 minutes, but it's still national television. First time I was on, the book went flying. But Johnny said to me on the show, as the show ended, he said, I'm really sorry, and I don't like to do this, and this is your first time out here. He said, would you be willing to stay over and do the show on Friday? And I'll have you on again. And I said, my daughter's got a soccer game. I said, of course. So I stayed over Thursday. They put me up at the Beverly Hills Hotel. I stayed over. I did the show again Friday with Johnny. Now it was on Wednesday. I'd never had a national show. I'd just been out there advancing confidently in the direction of doing what I loved. And now I had 2 Tonight Show appearances in 3 days. And then on Monday, they replayed the show from the previous week that had been preempted, and I had 3 Tonight Show appearances in 5 days, from Wednesday to Monday. And the book just went soaring. Yeah. And after that, it was Mike Douglas, it was Merv Griffin, it was Phil Donahue, who didn't want to hear the name Wayne Dyer. I did 4 full 1-hour shows with one with Anne Rand, which was like one of the great moments in my life. I became like a fixture on that show. Then John Davidson, then Dinah Shore. Remember Dinah Shore? Dinah Shore had her own show. I became the psychologist on the Dinah Shore show for 87 consecutive weeks. I was on her show once a week. And it just went on and on and on. And all it boils down to is like advancing confidently in the direction of your own dreams and endeavoring to live the life which you imagine, which you're filled with joy, and success will chase after you. It will chase after you. You just keep following, and you're not doing it so that you'll make money and be famous and get on the New York Times bestseller list. All of those things are just bonuses that come from you fulfilling your Dharma, living an inspired life, and not being willing to take no. And it's still going. That was 1976. That was over 40 years ago. And we're still doing it. People still come. And tonight there'll be about 2,500 people there. I got 8 kids that don't listen to anything I say. And now everybody wants to hear everything I say. And we have a new PBS show coming out in the fall. So that's basically, it's just in that knowing. And the truth of it is, Reed Tracy and I are like brothers, or I always say, I just never know. One day you're my brother, the next day I'm your father, the next day you're my father. We talk about so many of the things that Hay House undertakes, and so many of the really great ideas, the very successful books have come just out of our conversations about these kinds of things. I'll meet someone and say, I just want you to tell your story, and I'll write a foreword for it, and they'll publish it for you, and you just never know. You just, as long as you just stay like inspired, and then public television. I mean, I could tell you the same story about public television, because how many public television specials people have done? So many people have done them, and they only last one time, one pledge period, March, maybe again in August and so on. But I did it totally different with PBS. Reed and I and Luis, we put up the money for the first PBS show ourselves. And then I said, I will visit every station in the United States. And I've made, I thought it was 176, but Nikki told me it's over 200. Over 200 station visits. That means 4 hours on each one of those shows, often paying my own expenses, staying in very inexpensive hotels, and going into that city. It doesn't make any difference in raising money for them. City after city, pledge period after pledge period. And now, these pledge shows, I think the total amount of dollars raised by the PBS shows exceeds $200 million in the last 12 years raised for public television.